That's an important point. Mr. Deepanshu Mohan is also with us. He's written a very interesting piece on this, in fact. Mr. Mohan, one of the reasons why the OPS was withdrawn was that the idea was that it could become unsustainable in the long run. In fact, many have described the unified pension scheme also as an OPS-styled scheme. But do you find that this could, in a sense, become unsustainable? And then what would your answer be to those who say that, it was about time that we had this sort of reform because ultimately all government employee associations and bureaucrats across categories have welcomed this?
Yeah, so with that, I would probably submit that the rationale for announcing the unified pension scheme at this point clearly comes across as a political development, very less understood by any sound economic rationale. And I'll give you one statistic, which, in fact, for the BJP government, for its entire 10-year period, despite a lot of the other things not going right in terms of managing in recent years, inflation or creating sufficient employment growth, the middle class not being too happy with, and that's clearly something which the government is trying to address now with each of these interventions. Remember, they are very ad hoc. Nothing was said about this in the budget, which was presented very recently. But if you look at one statistic, I think it's very important to put this in context. The pension liabilities for the center and states had jumped manifold in the 3 decades that you saw between 1990 and 2020. In 1990, center's pension bill was somewhere around 3,272 crore. And for the states, it was around 3,131 crore. In 2020, the center's bill jumped 58 times to 190,886 crore.
That's right.
While for the states, it had gone up 125 times. Now, why this statistic is important to put it in context is we do not really understand the future fiscal impact of this repackaged, and I would use the word repackaged, OPS scheme to ensure that there is some level of certainty offered to government employees. Largely, the job creation in the government sector is not making most eligible for pension in any case. There's heavy subcontractualization. We all know that, where a lot of employees hired do not even get pension entitled. But even if they are, the Vajpayee government made it very clear by introducing the NPS scheme on January 1st, 2004, that with rising life expectancy, a heightened uncertainty around medical facilities improving and the life of people enlarging over on the average lifespan, it is very unsustainable to what extent you will have a fiscal impact of this calculated. So it would be good for the government, if it is really thinking about reform, to lay out the numbers beforehand in somewhat a reasonable period of time where you have a medium to long-term fiscal calculus worked out.
Okay.
What I would see this as a clearly regressive measure. We are going back into 2 decades of a period of time where the old pension scheme had given way to a more pragmatic NPS. You could have done much more around assuring a minimum pension through a slight tinkering of the NPS scheme. You didn't need to do something like a radical restructuring without opening the fiscal numbers that clearly.
So, contributory. Deepanshu Mohan, you were disagreeing with what Mr. Mahesh said earlier and also Ms. Sen's point. Go ahead.
I have great reverence for the esteemed panel, but I have to say this. See, on one hand, there is a lot of focus on talking about a capex-based crowding in effect of private investment, no clear talking about welfare ideology, which was dependent on a very entitlement-centric approach. The government on average has cut down spending on schemes like Manrega, food security programs, all of these plans that for which funding on a revenue expenditure side has come down was compensated by a higher capital expenditure. When the states like Himachal Pradesh in 2023, Rajasthan in 22, Chhattisgarh in 22, or Punjab in 22 went back to the OPS, old pension scheme, it was said that it was reverie or a sort of a dole being offered in gains of political ends. Now, what has happened inside the government that you have all, if the idea is that the NPS regulation is not changed much, why do you need a unified pension scheme? Just make an assured sum of money offered to people who have completed X number of years in government service and do it as part of the NPS scheme. There was a lot of thinking done when the NPS scheme was brought in. And just on one point, the debt to GDP ratio for state, I mean, the RBI carried a whole paper out.
That's right.
The Reserve Bank of India in 2023 mentioned that with the old pension scheme principles going back, which the unified pension scheme talks about, the cumulative fiscal burden would be as high as 5 times of the NPS. This was RBI's numbers in 2023. So I really don't see any logical economic rationale for this to happen.
Okay.
Important.
Okay, Deepanshu, a quick response to that. I'm afraid I only have 30 seconds on the debate. But the point Mr. Mahesh made on democracy, whatever you said about fiscal prudence, about, the economic ramifications, those are fair points. But the fact is that there was a demand from within the stakeholders, from government employees, for a potential overhaul of the pension scheme.
The stakeholders seem to be the middle class now because the government is struggling clearly in terms of getting their confidence. It's as simple as that. And
no, but would you concede that there was a demand, there was a need to do this?
No, there was a need. There's a need to increase Manrega allocations. There's a need to be able to allocate money for MSME sector, which has been struggling and has decimated employment creation. There are a lot of things that are not going right. I mean, the logic of the government has been for last 10 years that it is about fiscal consolidation. We don't want to spend money on entitlement. On one hand, we want to give free ration. On the other hand, there has to be a lot of focus on corporate tax cuts and the ability to ensure that there is sufficient leeway for revenue generation for the top 10%. And the middle class, which is squeezed, now the government realizes that there is a need to think about pension. So the last two panelists have already laid out that there is discussions on retirement age.
Yes.
That should have happened.
And I take your point that this is also part of a larger discussion, larger debate around.
So this is clearly not well thought through. I mean,